he's just exactly the kind of bully that Donald Trump is A, attracted to, B, emulates, and wants to be buddies with.
The president-elect Trump has boasted on many occasions of his strong relationship with President Putin. There had been quite a few conversations, though, about why Russia hadn't immediately reached out and congratulated Donald Trump. Well, in the last hour, that has just happened. The Russian leader has congratulated Donald Trump and says he's ready to speak to him. He's also outlined his vision for Russian foreign policy following the US election result. Diane Francis is a veteran columnist, National Post editor-at-large and a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC. Good evening to you, Diane.
Good evening.
What do you make of what Vladimir Putin has said there? Sort of a bit of a barb at the beginning. I wondered where it was going to go. Called him a businessman lacking experience, but then went on to say that he was impressed with how Donald Trump dealt with the attempt on his life.
Well, this is the flattery game. You know, he wants something out of Trump. He wants Trump to hand Ukraine on a platter and to forget that billions of dollars of American tax money has been dedicated and given to Ukraine to fend off Russia's rapacity. And, you know, this is just the old, it's a shameful show of flattery. And maybe flattery will get him somewhere, but I'm not sure. The phone call of congratulations was somewhat delayed. A few hours earlier, his spokesman was asked if he'd called, and he said, no, why should we bother? And then I think he thought better of that.
What does the Russian administration think of Donald Trump's comments that he would end the war within 24 hours? That's obviously not going to happen. But what do they think more widely about Donald Trump's confidence that he can get the war sorted? He's the only one that can bring an end to it.
Well, you know, everybody knows that Trump indulges in hyperbolic comments. He's always over the top. And so,
but a lot of his voters believed him, Diane. A lot of people hugely admired Donald Trump's insistence that he was going to end the war, that he was going to limit military aid. That will have attracted him some voters.
Yeah, well, the intention attracted the voters, but the hyperbole of "I'll do it in a day" and all that sort of bluster is so typically Trump. It's ridiculous. But I think that what Putin sees, they're licking their lips here, and because I think they don't want to admit it, but they don't want to continue this war because they're not doing well at this war. I mean, they're losing many more soldiers and tanks and face because this little Ukrainian army is incredible. And if he wanted to throw around flattery about valiance and courage, it really belongs to the Ukrainians, not to Mr. Trump.
We heard from Bob Woodward, the investigative journalist, in his book that Trump boasted that he'd spoken to Putin after he was no longer president, said that he'd sent him COVID-19 testing machines during a period in 2020 when they were scarce. What does Vladimir Putin think of that? Has any of that been debunked? Has any of that been commented on? This sort of huge, well, not huge, but this continued relationship that Donald Trump insists that he's had with Vladimir Putin.
Well, look, Putin is, whatever you think of him, and I don't think a lot of him morally, is one of the most powerful leaders in world history. I mean, he's sitting on top of a nuclear arsenal and a country that has 11 time zones, and he's waging war wherever he seems to want to, with relative impunity. And so he's just exactly the kind of bully that Donald Trump is A, attracted to, B, emulates, and wants to be buddies with. So I think it's kind of on that level. However, I don't want to demean Trump's importance in this situation right now. And he is also probably more powerful than Putin, certainly economically and militarily. And, you know, he has it within his grasp to end this terrible war that Putin has waged against a completely innocent Ukraine. And I'm rooting for him to do so.
Well, Nina Dos Santos is across this for us, former CNN Europe editor. Nina, good evening.
Good evening, Kate.
Let's look at Ukraine first. Trump, we know, wants a deal. He's indicated strongly that he wants that war to end. But European leaders are divided on this. I think there's probably a clear left, centre, right divide, isn't there, in terms of who wants what?
Yeah, and especially in the place where they're actually gathering this week, which is Budapest in Hungary. Remember that Viktor Orban appears to be the foremost Trump whisperer among those EU countries. And what he's trying to do is essentially lay the groundwork for creating some kind of alliance between other Eastern European countries, like, for instance, Slovakia, that also has a far right government as well, to try and lay the groundwork for potentially helping Donald Trump to, as he's put it, resolve the Ukraine war within 24 hours in office. So we've got some of those Eastern European countries led by the likes of Hungary that are sort of already starting to sow the seeds of doubt for more support for Ukraine. Whereas, of course, you've got more Western European countries that are continuing to be extremely vocal in the need to support Ukraine, repel Russia, because otherwise they feel that the whole of the rest of NATO and the EU, that, by the way, in this part of the world have a common border, will be next thereafter. But some of those big EU powers like Germany, their governments in the last week have begun to crumble.
Yes, that is the notable thing. And let's just mention that quickly before we get on to the comments of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. The German government's coalition has collapsed. That is after the Chancellor Olaf Scholz dismissed Christian Lindner, following weeks of clashes, really. Just give us a bit more information on that and what that means for Germany.
So obviously, Germany over the last few years has been ruled by this very uncomfortable green, red, and amber traffic light coalition of three parties that are pulling in other directions on all sorts of very important issues for Germany. So the Greens and the Free Democrats on the other side, the two junior members of that coalition, Free Democrats being Christian Lindner, the finance minister's party. They're very pro-business. And over successive times that Olaf Scholz has tried to wrangle with them over the budget, that junior coalition partner has stood firm and said, no, we will not bend Germany's fiscal rules. But the problem is that Germany's business model at the moment has come under huge strain. No longer can it rely upon Russia for cheap gas. No longer can it rely upon China to guzzle up all of its gas-guzzling cars. And it might have to contend with double-digit trade tariffs in a few months' time when Donald Trump gets into office, because that is what he's promised to do, to impose tariffs of between 10 and 20% on goods coming from places like the EU, and that would just cripple Germany's economy that's already started to stagnate, if not head into reverse gear for a few successive quarters. So obviously, for this reason, Olaf Scholz has said, look, there's a wake-up call that's needed here. We need to do something quickly because there's a big election, a national election on the cards next year in Germany. He's booted out the Free Democrat, pro-business party members that have been holding firm on not allowing him to boost the economy a bit more. But that means that this could precipitate early elections for Germany. Now, originally, Olaf Scholz wanted to, by firing his finance minister just yesterday evening, he wanted to have a no confidence vote in January so that he could then prep the country for early elections in March rather than in September. He's looking like he's coming under a huge amount of pressure from the Christian Democrats, the Conservative Party, that is topping the polls, that now wants him to have that no confidence vote as soon as possible.
Okay.
And that could mean Germany could head to the polls by January.
All right. As if we hadn't seen enough elections this year, more next year on the way, potentially. Let's just return back to the EU summit and the comments of the French President Emmanuel Macron. He has said Europe needs to grow some teeth or risk being eaten by the world's carnivores. Europe can't be the world's herbivore anymore following Donald Trump's re-election as United States president. This is according to Emmanuel Macron. It needs to become an omnivore instead. Strong comments. I mean, will he be one of the most critical voices in that room of Donald Trump? Could he be the one that's either going to have to row back significantly or the one who takes it to Donald Trump if the EU finds that they're seriously not aligned with the president-elect?
Well, you remember there was that big bromance, wasn't there, when Emmanuel Macron welcomed him and patted him on the back and gave him the longest handshake and hug, and the two wives, one of whom is the same amount older as of their spouse as the other one is younger, developed this rapport. Will he be able to replicate it? Well, things have changed substantially. Also, given the fact that Emmanuel Macron is essentially on his way out soon, he can't run for another term as president, just like the US president, after 2027. He's made a huge political miscalculation with these early elections in the summer, and his government is weak. So the problem here is that you have the axis that essentially makes all the decisions in Europe, Germany and France, is finding itself in political disarray. That's allowing people like Viktor Orban, who have autocratic tendencies that are against those key EU values, to sort of grab the Trumpian high ground, if you like. And so we're probably going to see a bit of a disconnect, I think, in terms of sort of Europe trying to put on this joint show, as we've seen in Hungary this week, but really things fraying quite a bit, particularly when it comes to the issue of security, because you'll know that, as you just heard there from Mark Rutte, there's huge pressure for countries to spend more. The Baltic countries are extremely worried that they could be next if there's a bad peace deal that's struck for Ukraine. But then at the same time, you've also got people like Emmanuel Macron, who some get very irritated with his talk of strategic autonomy, because they say that could give license to the United States to recuse itself from being the traditional security guarantor that it has been in this part of the world since the Second World War. So a few eyebrows, I think, raised in Emmanuel Macron, again raising this complicated strategic autonomy issue that he likes to at moments like this.
Great detail as ever. Nina Dos Santos, thank you for being with us, former CNN Europe editor.